Hello, and welcome to another live stream from Just in Time Worlds. I hope that you are looking forward to this one. Today, I'm going to be talking about religion and specifically building out some of the mythological elements around building your religion. I want to talk about um, building out your creation myth and with an emphasis on making it realistic for the myths that you're building and the interaction of various religions. So this might be a topic that takes multiple live streams. We'll see how it goes. So the first thing that one must obviously talk about in religion is what your in fantasy worlds. Of course, it is important to consider, are the gods real or are they fake? If they're fake gods, then you're dealing with more or less in our kind of world situation where, or non-interfering gods, let me put it like that. I'm not saying anybody, non-interfering gods. If you have non-interfering gods, then you're more or less looking at a situation where it is not a case of having real miracles proving people's faith the whole time. So you're going to have a lot more of our kind of setup with myths and creation myths and stories that are told and so on. If you have a situation where, for example, you have real gods that get directly involved, like say the Faerun gods in the world of Faerun, the D&D world of the Forgotten Realms, it becomes a whole different story to work with those gods because they don't just let a myth go. They will obviously bring a myth into kind of alignment with what they actually are, since these gods can manifest in the world and go, actually, you've got my creation myth wrong, and I'm gonna smack you in the face till you get it right. So you have a very different kind of setup with those kinds of interfering gods than you do with the remote or non-interfering gods. And that brings me to an important point that I want to discuss here, which is the mythology that springs up around gods and religions. So there's a simple, there's all of the creation stories and so on. But what I actually want to discuss is competitive mythology. So this is religious syncretism, which is the process that involves one religion borrowing or adapting myths from another, often to assert its own superiority or to ease the conversion of followers from one religion to another. Competitive mythology is often observed in religious traditions that have grown alongside one another or out of the same kind of roots. So, for example, if you look at Jesus's resurrection story, the Egyptian god Osiris was also resurrected, and there are some parallels in that story. The classic example of syncretism in this aspect is actually Jesus feeding the multitudes with loaves and fishes. In the Odyssey by Homer, the Greek Odyssey, there is a story of a rich man feeding a multitude of 4,000 with loaves and fishes. And there are marked similarities between the story as told in the Gospels of Jesus feeding the multitudes and of this rich guy feeding the multitudes. But the difference is that in the case of Jesus feeding the multitudes, it's done via a miracle. And it's also done in such a way that it's kind of a one-upsmanship. Jesus doesn't need money because he can multiply the loaves and fishes. And Tyrannus says, gods be greeting people in the afterlife, asking the newly dead. So how do people say I was created these days? Yeah. Yeah. In a non-interfering God's case, that is also real. That would indeed be a kind of scenario you could have in the afterworld where you go, what do you mean that was the actual myth? So in competitive mythology, your purpose, as I said, is around easing conversions, and around proving that one mythology is better than another. And you can see a great example with the Romans here. When they conquered Greece, they identified their gods with the Greek ones. So Zeus became Jupiter, Ares became Mars, and so on. This syncretism served the purpose of asserting the Roman pantheon's superiority, but also aligning the conquered Greeks more closely with the Roman culture. So when you have a expanding religion or an expanding empire, in the case of the Romans, you can end up with syncretism where the myths just get adopted and changed a little bit so that the conquering culture's superiority, or the expanding religion's superiority over the religion it's displacing, becomes evident in the mythology. It also does help with conversion and assimilation if you have an expansionistic religion. And I suppose I should talk here briefly about what an expansionistic religion is versus a non-expansionistic religion. An expansionistic religion is one where you can convert into the religion. An example of this is Islam or Christianity and so on. But there are religions where you cannot convert into it. You are born into the religion or you are not. Zoroastrianism is probably the most germane example to this, because Zoroastrianism is actually a dying religion that cannot be revitalized, because you are born into Zoroastrianism or you are not born into it. The end. So syncretism of mythology helps a lot when you have an expansionistic religion that does conversion and assimilation. And of course, early Christians often adopted pagan festivals and incorporated them into the Christian calendar. A prominent example is the transformation of Saturnalia into the celebration of Christmas, which facilitated the conversion of pagan populations to Christianity. Now, I do think it's important to say here that 2,000 years have passed since that holiday was adopted into the Christian calendar, and very little of the Saturnalia kind of elements remain after this long a period. I mean, Christmas is Christmas. There's no, you're more or less just pulling people's tails if you say that it's a pagan festival at this point. It's not. But it did start that way as part of the syncretism. You can also see syncretism in the evolution of religions. In Norse mythology, for example, there's an evolution from the older Vanir gods, who are associated with fertility and plenty, to the newer Aesir gods, who are associated with war and poetry. And you can see that this reflects the changes in society, in the society that worship them, as they move from a focus on agriculture to one of conquest and bardic traditions. And then it also happens in cultural clashes and in conquest. So I've already spoken about the Romans and the Greek gods, but they also did it into the Celts. The Roman conquest of Celtic lands resulted in the Roman goddess Minerva merging with a Celtic goddess Sulis, which led to the worship of Sulis Minerva in Roman Britain, not in all of Rome, just in Roman Britain, which showed the blend of Roman and Celtic cultures in that specific region. And in fantasy, this is very, very well used by Neil Gaiman in American Gods. So in here, in American Gods, you have the competing conflict between the old gods of ancient mythology who are losing their believers and the new gods of modern obsession like technology and media. And this whole conflict between these gods and the syncretism that results from that, as the old gods kind of absorb elements, as the new gods kind of absorb elements of the old gods and adopt their mythos into the new gods' mythology, is the driving force behind the plot. So, syncretism, I think, is an often overlooked part of building mythology in your fantasy worlds, especially if you have a continent that's got a lot of cultures on it. So you don't just have like one kind of monolithic culture, which is anyway a little bit weird. But let's say you've got a continent with a lot of cultures, interconnected cultures. Their myths should borrow from each other. Their religions should have syncretism. There should be recognizable elements between one and another. You should kind of be able to see those things. So I think that when you're building out the mythos of your religion, when you're building out your creation story and so on, it is a really important aspect to look at how the mythology could influence one another and how you can build one religion to another, which one came later, and how did it affect the one that came before it. Okay, so that was quite a chunky piece on syncretism and mythology and building out your mythology of your gods. You also have, of course, in religion, you have the clergy and religious leaders. So here, it also becomes very, very important to consider whether your gods are real or not, or interfering or not. Let's skip the whole real question and say interfering or not. If your gods are gods who allow influence in the world, it is possible that the priests can directly channel divine power. And as such, they would then have actual personal power as well as religious power. And it's important to bear in mind that priests would have power regardless of magic, okay? Because religion does exercise societal control. I mean, we've seen that in every element of our world's history. If you go back to the Bronze Ages, the first kings were priest kings. The priesthood influenced civilization from the very first time that we built our initial towns. So religious leaders would have power regardless of magic. But if they also actually channel divine power, at that point, they hold enormous personal power as well. But it might also be a check and balance system, because if your God is an interfering God who allows mortals to channel their power, then the God might very well prevent mortals from straying off the beaten path. Now, in our history, the world is littered with priests who have acted in terrible ways, and priests who have strayed away from their religion. But if you have an interfering God where people could very well be of such a nature that they are drawing power from the God, if that flow of power from the God stops, that might very well keep your priests on kind of the straight and narrow of your God's imposition will. And that would change, I think, both the perception of society on that priest, as well as the kind of people who would be priests of a high political rank, church political rank. I think you should also think about priests and gods in terms of straight magic. So, one of Mercedes Lackey's stories deals with a country that has a religion built around the sun. And the sun priests are supposed to have the ability to channel the god's power. But magic also exists in this world, like straight up magic. And for centuries, the priests no longer had the power to do the divine channeling of power thing, but they used actual magic to fake the divine magic. So this resulted in these corrupt priests controlling this whole country, which was a theocracy. They controlled the whole country for centuries through this corrupt practice, to the extent where they eventually went from using magic to fake the rituals to summoning demons and saying that this is the God's will. And it was a very kind of clear demonstration that even if you have an interfering God, even if you have a God that directly puts his hand into his followers' lives and manifests power, you can still end up in a position of corruption if people can fake the miracles. That story was a very interesting story, because in the end, the god did actually very directly interfere, and he killed the corrupt son of the sun and appointed a new son of the sun with direct intervention. So, as I said, it can be that if you have an interfering god, you can bring kind of the priests back in line. However, you run an enormous risk if you do this. And that is the problem with the Forgotten Realms. So I don't know how many people are familiar with the Forgotten Realms, but it is a D&D setting where you play, Dungeons and Dragons, kind of standard Dungeons and Dragons setting. But there's been a lot of books written in them, in this world, and some of them are quite good. But the problem is that the gods of Faerun interfere a lot. And I mean, they manifest and come down and actively participate in mortal lives. Now, I ask you, with tears in my eyes, if there is a literal God here fixing these problems, why do I have adventurers? Why do I have an adventuring party doing anything when there is a literal God fixing stuff? Why am I not writing a story about the literal God? So, so be careful if you do have interfering gods, if you have gods that can directly manifest in whatever way that is. And try to put in place some kind of rules that govern that they won't just randomly interfere, or make them indifferent, or make them like a little bit more standoffish, like or have consequences to their interference. Yes, Tyrannus says, why did the god wait so long? They had to farm enough heresy points to buy the tier 3 smite nuke. Exactly. You want some kind of limitation on the god's direct interference ability. Otherwise, you will just end up with a Faerun type situation where, man, I can't tell you the amount of times I've read Faerun stories and gone, well, that was a nice story, but then there was a god. Um, Then I think one of the other parts of religions that are often overlooked during kind of fantasy creation processes is the afterlife and reincarnation. Yeah, the evil eyes brought up a good point there. If you have multiple gods, then you can have like a balance of power situation. So if you interfere and help your followers, then I'll interfere and help my followers, and we reach a kind of Mexican standoff Cold War situation. So the whole relationship between the gods then becomes this Cold War situation where they can't do anything without, you know, the example is Hephaestus can't do anything in Egypt, or he risks declaring war on Horus and so on, which is a very good way to balance your gods, because at that point they have to act through intermediaries or they risk the whole thing going to pot. And as long as you have multiple competing pantheons that do more or less equal each other in power, you can use that very effectively. Now, the thing about religion that I think people often neglect to think about is the afterlife and reincarnation, or like where do people's spirits go, etc. And I think one of the reasons why we tend to not think about that too much is because none of us are planning on sending our characters to the afterlife, but, or at least I guess generally not. In Percy Jackson, Percy does in fact end up going to the afterlife, but as an alive person. But it is very important to consider those big questions, like what happens after death, because it is one of the central questions that religion tries to answer. You know, why are we here? Why is there suffering in the world? And what happens after we die? And often what happens after we die becomes a reward for living a good life in the here and now. You know, in even in the reincarnation philosophies, often your life that you live now will determine your life in the next life. I'll come back to reincarnation because I do have a thing that I want to say there about the results of that in terms of a caste system. But in other religions, like in the Norse religions, you have, of course, the afterlife of becoming a warrior and drinking mead and, you know, being gathered up by the god and living with your god. And notice that there isn't there isn't the dictimony of heaven and hell like there is in the Christian mythos. It is you will go to the god that you worship. But in the Roman case, you definitely do have a form of punishment for those souls that commit evil. And that is the whole, you know, Hades judges you, and you either go to like Elysium, or you go to the place where you kind of just stand around, or you go to you go to the fields of punishment. And that kind of post life punishment can often result in philosophies where you have to live a good life out of fear for what's going to happen next, and you execute people and send them to the gods for punishment. So there's a kind of weird ethos that grows out of that. And results may indeed vary as to whether your soul is eternal or not, and how long you're trapped in whatever afterlife you go to. I do want to come back to reincarnation. So reincarnation, if your reincarnation mythos says that what you do in this life determines who you are in the next life, you can end up in a really, really heinous caste system. And Catherine Kerr explored this in her work. The reason why her magic users keep it a secret that souls are reincarnated in Devery is because when they told people originally that, you know, you could do this, that this does happen if you you are reincarnated, it became a part of their religion. So the priests were like, we are the pinnacle. We lived such good lives in the previous lives that we have now been reincarnated as priests, the highest of the high in this life. And the same for their magic users. Their magic users were like, well, we have been reincarnated with actual power. That is how good we were in our previous lives. And they used that as a form of dominance over the people around them. And the great powers of the world that she created eventually stepped in and forbade Dwemer masters from telling people about the reincarnation process, because Dwemer masters had grown so corrupt and so evil in this oppression of people due to the good previous lives they had led. So if you have reincarnation in your world, it is worth considering whether that concept of karma, dharma, and so on actually does exist. Like, does this life in any way affect the next life? Okay. So in my world, I consciously took the decision that I do have reincarnation, but what you did in the previous life in no way affects the next life. You are wiped clean of everything and simply born again. But of course, I mean, people can, there are still cultures in my world that do still absolutely believe that what you do in the previous life affects this life, because it is a way to create a caste system and have everybody buy into that caste system. And because my gods are mostly non-interfering gods, um, that's what you get. Yeah, Kit brings up a great point about, for the Chinese, what you get in the afterlife depends on what papers and offerings are burnt at your funeral. So this is also a kind of part of the concept around grave goods. So the Vikings had it as well. You had goods buried with you in your grave, which you would then take with you to the afterlife. Otherwise, you would be in the afterlife without a weapon, without a means to defend yourself. In the very early parts of Viking history, well, I don't know how very early, I don't know when the last time was that they did this, that included the sacrifice of a woman who was essayed. I'm on YouTube, sorry, there's words you can't say. Who was essayed by all of the people in the chief's tribe, all of the men in the chief's war band, and then unalived to accompany the chief into the afterlife. So that kind of concept does exist as well, although the Chinese being an actual offering is actually also really interesting. So in that case, if that's true in your world, you'll definitely spend some time being nice to your family in the hopes that they will offer some good stuff for when you die, so that you get to have a good afterlife. I think it's also worth considering the impact that afterlife has on your ethical and moral codes. Now, I personally think that ethical and moral codes are kind of a six of one, half a dozen of another. I don't think that religion makes ethical codes. I think that ethical codes grow between the religion and the society, and they kind of like combine into an ethical code for that society. But if you have real interfering gods, they might very well send down like an ethical code list. But the thing to bear in mind is that an eternal being, like, especially if we're talking like creator of the universe kind of thing, I cannot imagine that such a being would have the same morality we do. Think Just consider for a moment if you were capable of actually perceiving quantum fields and you could make quantum bits interact with each other and you could manipulate the universe at that level. What would the word murder even mean to such a being? Like it's so far beyond my state of comprehension. I cannot understand what kind of morality would come out of such a being. Um, so so yeah, Doge has got a interesting question here. He says, "Oh, I learned a new word. An interfering god is called eminent." Nice. So Doge says he's got some 30 odd gods, and what are some interesting ways to embed gods into the lore? So I did talk a little bit about this in the syncretism, but basically, you're going to have probably a lot of Greek style myths and so on, where, you know, the occasions when the gods came down and did things. Like a lot of Greek mythology is Zeus taking various forms and engaging in um, things that will get me demonetized on YouTube. That time he turned into a swan, the time he turned into a bull, the time he, all the times. They're all there. But there are also some other Greek myths that you um, that you can build on in terms of embedding the gods in the lore. What you want from your lore when you're building these mythologies is you want to have um, the gods' actions reflect what you want people to understand the gods to be. So, if the gods are direct interfering, what's that word again? Eminent. Eminent gods, interfering gods. Then they should ideally have myths where they interfere, where you show the limitations of their interference and when they can interfere. If they are non-eminent gods, then the myths should be stories of them nudging this or giving some hero power, you know, Moses parting the Red Sea, or you know, the feeding of the multitudes, these kinds of more indirect actions, actions through a human vessel, rather than the direct interference of the gods that you see in Greek mythology. So I hope that answers your question, Doge. And Evil Eye makes a nice point about if he was a god over ants, he would 1,000% be a blind, cruel, and indifferent master. Yes, me too. And that's what I mean about the difference in scale. Like, I don't think an ant can conceive of what I think of as morality. You know, so it's just it seems weird to me, like that you could have a morality come from such a being. And yeah, Kit makes a good point about the Belgariad. There you have direct interference by the gods, at least early on, and you can see different gods and how they influence the people that they have control over. And that control is very much why every culture in that world is a trope of the hats. Every Drasnian is a thief and so on. Like all of these cultures is derived from the fact that their God is like this and he made his people like this. It's still a little bit lazy world building, but I very much enjoyed those books as a child, so or as a teenager. So, you know, I do have appreciation for them. And I see I have been talking for 35 minutes. So I have spoken about the first 5 points on my religion topic. So I think that I might have to revisit religions in another live stream. Look out on the community tab. I will be putting up a vote for the next 2 live streams and what you would like me to cover. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining this live stream. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found value out of it. And I hope I will see you again in 2 weeks. Cheers, guys.